My next guest is David Hillar. He is co-owner of Casa Co-Host Property Management. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, David.
Thanks so much, Val. It's great to be here.
Great.
Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So you recently wrote an article titled "Short-Term Rentals Are the Scapegoat, Not the Crisis." Why did you feel it was necessary to write this article?
Thanks, Val. Yeah, I did write that article recently. I felt that with the federal election backdrop that we just had, we heard every party talk about the housing crisis in Canada, and it's on the lips of a lot of Torontonians and folks in Ontario, right across the country. And the subtext of a lot of those articles that I read and that I heard in the election campaign was that it was things like Airbnb that were really causing this issue in Canada, that, you know, investors were hoovering up all the new supply of housing, and that was resulting on housing showing up on the short-term rental market. And as a professional in the space, I can tell you that's absolutely not the case. And a lot of owners are not actually moving into the short-term rental space, even somewhat by choice. They have these units and they're experiencing issues when it comes to long-term rentals. They're either having terrible tenancy situations, they're getting into non-payment scenarios. And so I felt the need to just write something that reflected what I'm seeing in the space versus what the media and what a lot of the subtext of this election discussion was all about.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense. I'm also a short-term rental owner myself. So I certainly believe, I believe I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that is a bit of a struggle that people do see that. And I think they have the misguided notion that if you take away the rights of people to be able to rent their place short term, that they will automatically go back to long-term rentals. And just as you said, because of some of the experiences that they've had, whether it's, you know, they've had bad tenants, people not paying rent, a lot of those people, if they weren't in the short-term rental market, they just might sell their place or just use it as their own vacation property. They're not going back to long-term rentals. They've already decided that ship has sailed for them.
That's exactly right. And in a lot of these cases, folks are renting as well, not as a full need state. So it is their primary residence, and they may avail folks to it when they're traveling, or, you know, when it's being underutilized for a few months because they've gone to stay with family or they have their own recreation property. So a lot of these Airbnbs are there because the owner's also just choosing to make a little bit of additional income on their primary residence as opposed to a full-on rental for them as well.
Yeah, and you know what? I've also seen some young people, because they're, you know, struggling to get into the Toronto housing market. I've seen some young people say, you know what? They're going to rent in Toronto, but they'll buy a place in a cheaper cottage area and they'll rent that out on Airbnb just to help, you know, build up their income so that they can get to a point where they can actually buy a house in Toronto. So I find that people are actually using it in really creative, interesting ways. So, you know, people who rent out short term, we're not all bad people, you know?
Yeah. And so that's exactly the point, right? But what we're seeing is this narrative that says you are bad people. And so I think it's become a bit of a scapegoat issue that comes back to the reason for the article in the first place.
And so explain to us, so for example, in Toronto, you know, because you are licensed, so some people are licensed and some people are unlicensed. So explain to us the pitfalls between the licensed people and the not licensed people with the 28-day rule.
Yeah, so let's clarify on that. So most or many municipalities now, right across Ontario, have short-term licensing rules. They came about because there were issues in the past. So there was some, you know, notorious cases in Montreal and some other markets where, you know, there was unkempt parties or even in some cases a fire that broke out. So the municipalities were forced to say, we have to do something here. We have to have a regulation so that there's some standards in place. So in order to qualify for that, you do need to apply to your municipality. You have to show evidence that this is, you know, a primary residence or a residence that you own, and that you're going to follow a number of standards, be it, you know, parking plans, garbage plans, other things like that. Once you do have that license, then you're availed that ability to rent for a short term up to 28 days. Over 28 days typically, or 30 days in some municipalities, you don't require a license. That falls in the sort of monthly housing stock, and it's a more traditional rental. So there's no regulation around that. So in terms of pitfalls, I mean, some of the pitfalls can be right at the outset. Getting licensed, the city of Toronto has inspectors that go out and come to visit your place, and they may say, sorry, you don't qualify for a license. You haven't posted a floor plan on the front door or near the exits as to how to get out of the property. Well, Some properties only have one door that goes out if it's a basement suite or a front door. So that can be a reason that you don't get the license. There could be something that comes down to a documentation fact. You didn't submit a quarterly report that says I'm renting short term, and because of that, the city revokes your license as well. So there can be a lot of procedural hurdles that come into play, and I think that's where some owners turn to professionals like us, because we understand those rules and we understand the onus that's on the owner to provide all the right documentation. So that can be a clear hurdle for some folks who've never done this before.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I also, not only am I a short-term rental owner, but I'm also a user of short-term rentals as well, too. And I think that that's one of the aspects that people forget, is that for someone like myself, I can't afford to own a cottage in Muskoka. But do I want to go visit Muskoka? Yes, I do. And so therefore, my girlfriends and I, and my husband as well too, we rent a cottage in Muskoka for a week because we want to be able to still enjoy that area, but none of us could afford to own a cottage in that area. So I think it's also really important that it allows all of us to be able to go and visit areas where it might just be too expensive for us to actually own property in that location as well too.
And might be too expensive to stay otherwise, right? If your options are staying at a Rosso resort or something like that, I mean, from an affordability standpoint, for a lot of us, it's not practical. So absolutely, there's that ability for folks to travel and see parts of our great province, great country, and that fills a need as well.
Absolutely, and I think also too, there's a lot of people who just don't want to be in that hotel environment, especially if you're with a big family or friends. You like the idea of being able to cook your own food in your particular place, wherever you're visiting. So I think that that's the other thing too, that people really value with short-term rentals. How many short-term rentals would you say are actually out there in the marketplace right now?
It's hard to say from a fixed number. It's oscillating every single month. In the city of Toronto, I've seen numbers with respect to Airbnb specifically that could go anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 units. And it also depends on what you consider, again, a short-term rental, right? So there's, half the population on Airbnb are not renting for 2 or 3 nights at a time. They are renting monthly. So it's tough to say from that number. If you do look at StatsCan, though, StatsCan will tell you that only about 0.5%, so between 0.5% and 0.7%, are short-term rentals that are taking away from potential long-term housing. So again, we talk about scapegoating, by Statistics Canada's own metrics, less than 1% of all housing available in Canada is in this short-term space. So it's a very small, fractional number overall in terms of the housing stock. But in a lot of people's minds, it's my neighbor, it's the one across the street, it's the one around the corner. So I think that the reality versus the actual statistics is quite different. So overall, it's quite small in terms of housing stock. But what is the absolute number? A little bit hard to say from a day-to-day basis. But
that's a pretty good indication that it's basically less than 1% of the housing stock is being used as short-term rentals. And so therefore, yes, why scapegoat short-term rentals to say that that's what is causing all of these housing problems when really it's less than 1% of the market out there for sure.
Absolutely. And it's been an industry that's been around for forever. It's just been advanced by technology, obviously. Folks have been renting their cottages and, as you said, Muskoka for the last 100 years to friends and families and neighbors and things like that. And there's never been, a uproar, and there hasn't been much discussion. And now all of a sudden it's become, every factor of it is being licensed, and there's deep discussions around it. And can you only have 7 guests in a property or 8? So it's become, very much into the minutia of it, and very strict for some owners to try to wrap their head around the regulations.
Absolutely. David, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been great chatting with you.
Thanks for having me on. Have a great Saturday.
Great. Thanks so much. That was David Hillar, co-owner of Casa Co-Host Property Management.